tow men, one cockpit, a fighter plane built for a single pilot, screaming low over occupied France with a dying engine and no parachutes left to save either of them. On an August afternoon in the summer of 1944, a 21-year-old lieutenant named Royce Priest did something the United States Army Air Forces had no training for, no procedure for, and no permission for. He watched the man he idolized go down in flames behind German lines, and instead of marking the spot and flying home the way the rule book demanded, he pushed his stick forward and dropped his own single-seat Mustang into the same wheat field. The enemy was already racing to reach. What happened next would land on the desk of a general who had once bombed Tokyo. It would force a choice between a court-martial and the highest medal in the nation, and it would stay hidden, buried, almost forgotten, for the rest of both men's lives. This is the true story of how two American pilots folded themselves into a space meant for one and gambled everything on a single desperate flight home. Not one part of it was supposed to work. Not one of them was supposed to survive. Make yourself comfortable with your favorite drink. Then check the time and tell us exactly what your clock says right now. We'd love to know what time people around the world are joining us. The wheat was the color of old gold that August, and it ran to the horizon in every direction, soft and endless, hiding everything. That was the cruel thing about the French countryside in the summer of 1944. From high above, it looked like peace itself. Neat fields, quiet farm roads, church steeples catching the afternoon light. A man could almost forget that every haystack might be a gun, every barn a nest of steel, every red cross painted on the side of a boxcar. A careful and patient lie. Lieutenant Royce Priest was 21 years old, and he had learned that lesson faster than most men. Learn anything at all. He had 2 months of combat behind him, 2 months of climbing into a machine that weighed as much as a small house, strapping himself to more than 1,000 horses of roaring Merlin engine, and throwing all of it at the ground, while men he could not see did everything in their power to kill him. In those 2 months, he had watched friends fall out of the sky. He had heard the calm and terrible voices on the radio go silent in the middle of a sentence and never come back. He had grown old in a way that had nothing to do with birthdays. By that summer, the losses had become a kind of weather, something you flew through and tried not to think about. The men of the 8th Air Force were dying over France at a pace that no one liked to say out loud. The German gunners had turned concealment into an art. They tucked their weapons inside haystacks and farmhouses and the ruins of villages. They painted the marks of mercy on the machines of slaughter. A low-flying fighter, sweeping the ground for trains and trucks and troops, flew into a gauntlet of hidden fire. Every single time. Priest's own group had buried the memory of more than a dozen pilots in the past 2 months. Some had died in an instant. Some had crawled out of wrecked airplanes in enemy fields and vanished into prison camps for the rest of the war. A few had simply disappeared, their names left hanging, their fates never known. A young pilot learned to live inside that arithmetic without ever writing it down. He learned the smell of his own cockpit, the hot oil and the leather and the cold metal, and he learned to breathe slow when the flak came up. He learned that the men who lasted were not the ones who felt no fear, but the ones who could set the fear down for a moment and do the work in front of them. He learned that the sky at altitude was so beautiful, so silent and blue and clean, that it seemed almost obscene that men were burning to death beneath it. He carried all of that behind his eyes, folded up and put away every time he climbed the wing and settled into the seat. But that afternoon, flying above the fields near a rail line deep in occupied territory, Royce Priest was not thinking about dying. He was thinking about the man in the airplane ahead of him, the man he had followed halfway around the world, the man he wanted to become. Major Burt Marshall, long before either of them ever wore a uniform. Priest had known the name. In Texas, Where the game of football sits somewhere close to religion, Burt Marshall had been a 3-time All-State quarterback, a young man with a golden arm, and his name in the newspapers on Saturday mornings. He had gone on to play at Vanderbilt and earned honorable mention as an All-American. He was the kind of man other men watched from a distance and quietly wished they could be. So when Priest arrived at the fighter group and discovered that Burt Marshall was in his squadron, in the flesh, he counted it, the single luckiest break of his young life. He studied the older man the way a beginner studies a master. He copied his turns. He memorized his tactics. He hung on every word Marshall offered about how to stay alive in the sky. And he carried all of it up into his own cockpit, like a man carrying water in cupped hands. Afraid to spill a drop, what made it more remarkable still was how new Marshall himself was to the fighter. He had come to the squadron in early summer with only a few hours in the Mustang, fresh from an older and slower airplane, and yet the man seemed born to it. His second combat mission had been the invasion itself. The 6th of June, and over the beaches of Normandy he had shot a German dive bomber out of the sky. 2 weeks later he destroyed 2 more enemy fighters in a single day. By the first days of August he had 5 confirmed victories, which made him an ace faster than any pilot in the history of the group. Promotions chased after him like they were trying to keep up a pilot to flight leader in a matter of days. Flight leader to operations officer in 2 weeks. Operations officer to squadron commander in under 2 months. He led from the front, always, because he did not seem to know how to do it any other way. That was the reason he was flying at all that afternoon. As a squadron commander, he could have stayed on the ground and sent his flight leaders to do the dangerous work. He could have delegated it, the way a careful man would. Instead, he had put himself at the head of a 4-ship flight, low over enemy country, hunting along a German rail line for anything worth a burst of .50 caliber fire. They found the train near a town whose name Priest would carry with him for the rest of his life. The strafing run began the way all of them began, a shallow dive, throttles easing forward. The earth swelling up in the windscreen until you could count the furrows in the fields. Marshall led them down toward a string of rail cars sitting quiet on the track below. It looked like an ordinary target. Some of the cars even wore the Red Cross, the mark that was supposed to mean the wounded, the protected, the ones a decent man left alone. Then the sides of the cars fell away. It happened in less than a heartbeat. The wooden panels dropped flat, and behind them, waiting, sat rows of anti-aircraft guns, their barrels already swinging up to follow the diving. Americans, 20 millimeter, 40 millimeter. Steel throats built to reach up and tear an airplane apart. It was a trap laid with patience and with cruelty. A flak battery folded inside a train, sprung at the exact moment the Americans committed to the dive. The Germans had grown into masters of this kind of thing, and now they had hidden their guns behind the very symbol of mercy. The 4 Mustangs had flown straight into the muzzles at point-blank range. The air came apart around them. Tracers rose in bright ropes, so thick a man could believe he might walk across them. Bursts of fire stitched the sky, close enough to feel through the airframe, close enough to taste. And in the middle of all of it, Priest saw the one thing he had feared for 2 months, without ever letting himself say the words out loud. Marshall's airplane was hit. Black smoke poured from the nose of the Major's Mustang. A round had punched into the engine somewhere below the exhaust stacks. Another had torn open the belly scoop where the coolant lived, and now a pale trail of that lifeblood streamed away behind him into the rushing air. Priest knew what it meant. He knew it in his stomach before his mind had finished the thought. An engine bleeding like that had minutes left in it, and probably fewer than a man would hope. The crippled fighter fell away toward a field of golden wheat, somewhere well behind the German lines, and Royce Priest, 21 years old, 2 months into his war, watched the man he idolized drop out of the sky toward a prison cell or a grave. The rule was not a complicated one. Every fighter pilot knew it the way he knew his own name. When a man went down behind enemy lines, his wingmen were to mark the place, radio the position back for the search and rescue people, and turn for home. That was the whole of it. Attempting a pickup was not merely frowned upon, it was considered flatly, physically impossible. Because the Mustang was a single-seat fighter. There was one seat, there was no room for a passenger, there was no line in any manual on this earth that told a man how to land in an enemy wheat field. And there was certainly no training for the thing that was beginning to take shape. Quietly and terribly, in the young lieutenant's mind, he watched Marshall's burning airplane sink below the far tree line and vanish. Then, without quite deciding to, without any part of him giving the order out loud, he eased his own controls, stick forward, and began to descend toward the same field. His radio crackled. It was Marshall's voice, alive, hard, furious, even through the static. The major was giving him a direct order: turn around, break off, go home. Priest's gloved hand drifted toward the radio switch. He could answer. He could say the words a good officer was trained to say: the Roger, the Wilco, the understood, and roll his wings toward England and leave the Germans to collect his hero out of the wheat. That was the safe choice. That was the sane one. That was the choice the rule book demanded. The choice every instinct built for survival was screaming at him to make. His hand stopped, somewhere in the space of those few seconds, without weighing the odds, without counting what it might cost him. Royce Priest had already made up his mind. He looked at the smoke rising from the tree line, and he thought of the boy in Texas who had cut out newspaper clippings about a quarterback with a golden arm. He was not going home alone. The Mustang was never built to touch a field like this. Everything about the airplane argued against it. The great liquid-cooled engine sat low in the nose, and beneath its belly hung the scoop that fed cool air to the radiator. Close to the ground, hungry, fragile. Anything taller than a man's boot could reach up into that scoop and tear the cooling system open. And once the coolant was gone, the engine would cook itself to death in a matter of minutes. The landing gear had been designed for smooth concrete runways in England, not for the soft and secret ground of a French farm, where a single hidden rut or a buried stone could fold a strut like paper and flip the whole machine onto its back in a cartwheel of fire. Royce Priest knew all of this. He knew it the way he knew the back of his own hand. And he set it all aside. He dropped his flaps and let the airspeed bleed away until the airplane felt heavy and mushy in his hands. Hanging just above the edge of a stall, he picked out the longest unbroken stretch of golden wheat he could find and lined his nose up on it. The trouble was that the nose of a Mustang, high and proud in the landing attitude, blocked everything straight ahead. He could not see where he was going. So he flew the approach the only way a man could, by hanging his eyes out the side of the canopy, judging his height above the crop by the blur of the stalks, streaking past his wingtip, feeling for the ground with something older than instrument. The wheels struck hard. The airplane bounced once, came down, bounced again, and then settled at last into the soft earth with a long shudder that ran through the whole airframe. Wheat lashed against the fuselage. Priest stood on the brakes with both feet, and the fighter dragged itself to a stop, trembling, a few hundred yards short of the tree line where Marshall's burning airplane had gone in. For one strange moment, there was only quiet. The engine idling, the wheat nodding, the enormous emptiness of a place a man was never supposed to be. Then Priest went to work, because he understood that quiet was the most dangerous thing in the world right now. He swung the fighter around on its wheels until the nose pointed back the way he had come, back toward open field, and the wind, if he had to leave in a hurry, and he would He could not afford to waste a single second turning the airplane around. The stretch of wheat in front of him ran perhaps half a mile before it met the trees. It would have to be enough. He told himself it would be enough high above. The two surviving pilots of the flight had watched the landing with a disbelief that bordered on horror. They circled at 1,500 feet, throttled back, eyes sweeping the roads and the hedgerows for the thing they all knew was coming. They did not have to wait long. A truck appeared on a dirt road half a mile to the east, moving fast, throwing up a plume of dust. The canvas stretched over its bed meant men, infantry, riflemen, a load of them, 20 soldiers, maybe 30. They were coming for the airplane, sitting impossibly in the wheat. And for the American fool who had put it there, the two Mustangs overhead did not hesitate. They rolled in. Each of them carried a battery of 50 caliber machine guns in the wings, and together those guns could throw out a river of steel. The lead pilot opened fire from a quarter mile out, walking his tracers up the road and into the truck's engine, and the vehicle swerved, caught fire, and rolled into a ditch with its cargo spilling out. The second Mustang came behind him and hammered the wreck to be certain no one climbed out of it to reach the field on foot. But the pilots above could see what Priest, low in the wheat, could not. More was coming. A second truck rolled in from the north. A motorcycle with a sidecar bounced along a farm track to the south. The Germans were closing in from every point of the compass, drawn to the crash the way iron filings are drawn to a magnet. The clock, which had been running since the moment Marshall was hit, was running faster. Now, Priest stood up in his cockpit and searched the tree line with his eyes. Smoke still rose from the woods where the major had gone down. By now, Marshall would have destroyed his own airplane. Every pilot carried a thermite grenade for exactly that purpose, to set fire to a downed fighter so that its secrets, its engine, its gun sight, the little box that told friend from foe, would not fall into enemy hands. That took time. Every second Marshall spent making certain his Mustang burned was a second he was not running toward rescue. And a second the German soldiers were coming closer. A minute passed. The fighters overhead rolled in on the motorcycle and scattered its riders into a hedge. Priest did the arithmetic in his head, and he did not like the answer. The soft ground had already grabbed at his wheels on the landing and left deep ruts behind him. Getting the airplane off the ground again would take every inch of the field and every ounce of the engine, and now he meant to do it carrying a second grown man's weight in a cockpit built for one. That extra weight would raise the speed at which the wings would fly. It would stretch the run he needed. The mathematics were brutal and simple. He might not have enough field. He might use up all his wheat and all his engine and all his luck and still be rolling on the ground when he reached the trees. 2 minutes. Still no Marshall. The second truck had stopped a quarter mile off, and through the shimmering air, Priest could see men dropping down from the bed of it, spreading out into a loose line, beginning to push through the wheat toward him, on foot. Helmets, the dull glint of rifles, coming slow and coming sure. 3 minutes, and then, at last, a figure broke out of the tree line. Bert Marshall was running. His flight suit was black with soot. His face, even at a distance, was twisted. And Priest understood in the same instant that it was not twisted with relief. It was twisted with rage. Marshall was waving his arms as he ran, not in greeting, not in thanks, but in fury. And the message his arms were sending was as plain as any radio call: leave. Leave now. Leave without me. For a beat, Priest did not understand it. The man he had come to save was ordering him away. And then he did understand it, all at once. And it broke his heart a little, because it was the most martial thing in the world. The major had done the arithmetic too. He could see the ruts and the soft ground and the trees. He could see that a single-seat fighter had almost no chance of dragging two men into the air off a field like this. He had decided he would rather be a prisoner than watch the boy who worshipped him die trying to save him. He was giving Priest an order, and the order was to live. Priest looked at the running man, and he looked at the soldiers coming through the wheat, and he made the only argument he had left. He climbed out of the cockpit. He stood up on the wing in the open, in plain view of the enemy line. And he reached down and unbuckled his parachute harness and let it fall in a heap onto the metal. Then he pulled loose his survival dinghy, the little rubber raft that was supposed to keep a man alive if he went into the sea, and he flung it out into the wheat. He understood exactly what he was doing. Without the parachute, he could not jump if the engine failed on the long flight home. Without the dinghy, he would drown if they went down over the cold gray water of the channel. He was throwing away his own last 2 chances to survive in front of the man he had come for, so that there could be no argument left, no misunderstanding, no ambiguity of any kind. The message was final. I am not leaving France without you. If you stay, I stay, and I die here in this field with you. Marshall stopped running. He stood perhaps 50 yards from the airplane, chest heaving, staring at the discarded parachute lying on the wing and the raft lying in the wheat. Above them, the soldiers' helmets bobbed closer through the golden crop. The 2 Mustangs overhead had spent most of their ammunition on the trucks and had maybe 1 more pass in them, maybe 2, before their guns went dry, and they became nothing but spectators. Whatever calculation had lived behind Marshall's eyes, it collapsed. There was no more time for argument, and no more argument to be made. He put his head down, and he sprinted the last of the distance to the airplane. Now they faced the impossible part. The cockpit of a Mustang was a tight fit for 1 man wearing a parachute and a survival vest and all the gear a pilot carried into combat. It was a space built to the shape of a single human being, and no larger. It was not built for 2. Marshall was a big man, tall and solidly made, a former quarterback who had carried other men off the field in his youth. Priest was a little smaller, but he still filled out his flight gear. Together, they were being asked to fold into a box meant for half of them. Marshall went in first. He climbed up onto the wing and lowered himself down into the seat and slid as far forward and as far down as a body could go. His back pressed flat against the armored plate behind the seat. His legs stretched out beneath the instrument panel on either side of the control stick. He made himself into cargo. He made himself into ballast. He made himself as small as a big man can make himself, and he waited. Then Priest climbed in on top of him. He lowered himself down onto Marshall's lap, his own legs straddling the Major's thighs, his knees rising up on either side of the control stick, his shoulders jammed against the older man's chest, their bodies pressed together and compressed tighter and tighter, packed like freight into a crate. The stick jutted up between Priest's knees where he could barely reach it. Their 2 heads came up nearly to the glass. Priest reached up and dragged the canopy closed over them, and it latched with less than the width of a hand to spare above his flight helmet. Inside that glass box, in the full weight of the August sun, the heat was instantly murderous. The canopy trapped the light and turned the cockpit into an oven. Sweat sprang out on both of them and soaked through their flight suits before the wheels had even begun to move. They could hardly breathe. They could hardly move. Priest's knees blocked half the instrument panel, but he could still see the gauges that mattered most: the fuel pressure, the oil, the manifold pressure, and that would have to do. He pushed the throttle forward. More than 1,000 horses of Merlin engine woke up and roared, and the whole airframe shook with it. The propeller clawed at the air and dragged the overloaded fighter forward through the wheat, but it came slowly, far too slowly. The weight of 2 men and full ammunition and what fuel remained had pushed the airplane far past the weight it was ever meant to fly at, and the soft ground pulled at the wheels like hands, and the wheat battered endlessly against the belly scoop underneath. Priest watched the airspeed crawl upward, 60 miles an hour, 70, 80, and ahead of them, growing in the windscreen with every second, stood the tree line at the far edge of the field. A Mustang, unburdened, lifted off at around 100 miles an hour. Loaded like this. Priest guessed he would need at least 15 more than that. His needle showed 95, and the trees were coming, filling the glass, close enough now to see the individual branches reaching up. There was no more field left to use. He hauled back on the stick. The wheels came unstuck from the earth. The airplane staggered into the air more than it flew into it, wallowing, barely climbing, and the stall warning began to scream in their ears. A thin electric shriek that meant the wings were on the ragged edge of quitting. The treetops rushed at them. For one endless instant it seemed certain they would not clear it, that the whole desperate gamble would end in a ball of flame in the top of a French oak. Branches scraped and clattered against the belly of the airplane. Priest held the nose right at the edge of the stall, coaxing every scrap of lift out of the wings, asking the airplane for more than it had, and then the trees were behind them, and they were up, climbing slowly and painfully over the fields of occupied France. Two men crammed into one seat, alive against every reasonable expectation on this earth. Behind them, the German soldiers came out of the wheat and stood at the edge of the field and watched the overloaded Mustang stagger away to the west. Their prize had slipped through their fingers by the width of a treetop, but Royce Priest and Bert Marshall were not safe. They were nowhere near safe. They were still deep over enemy country, more than 100 miles from the sea and more still from home, in an airplane loaded far past its limits, with an engine that was already beginning to run hot from the strain and from the wheat packed into its throat. The two escort pilots slid into position on either wing as the little formation climbed. Their job had changed. With their guns all but empty, they could no longer fight. But they could watch, and they could guide, and they could be there. They shepherded the overloaded fighter east and north, toward the coast, toward the cold water and the white cliffs, and the country on the far side of it that meant home. Priest leveled off and pulled the power back to a gentler cruise, because the engine temperature had been climbing since the wheels left the ground, and he had to nurse it now or lose it. That was the new enemy. And it was a crueler one than any German gunner. The belly scoop had swallowed wheat and dirt and stalks during the long run across the field. And now the air that was supposed to cool the great engine could not get through. The needle crept toward the red with every passing minute, patient and remorseless, and there was nothing Priest could do to stop it except fly gently and pray. The land below unrolled slowly, more than 150 miles of occupied France still lying between them and the Channel coast. German gun batteries dotted the route. Enemy airfields sat close enough that fighters could be scrambled in minutes if a spotter on the ground reported an American airplane crawling home low and slow and alone. Priest kept his altitude low enough to slip beneath the reach of the radar and high enough to have somewhere to go if the engine finally quit. Inside the glass, the heat had become a living torment. The two men were drenched, gasping, cooking in the trapped sun, and Marshall, pinned underneath, was paying a price all his own. Priest's full weight bore down on the major's legs, and within minutes the blood stopped reaching them. His feet went numb first, then his calves, then his thighs, one dead length at a time. He could not shift even an inch to bring the feeling back. The narrow box held them both, locked in place, motionless, as though they had been sealed there. Two men suffering in silence, so that neither would have to name the fear out loud. There is a strange thing that happens between men in a moment like that. They did not speak. There was nothing useful to say, and no breath to spare on saying it. But Marshall could feel the boy's heartbeat where their bodies were pressed together, quick and hard, and Priest could feel the older man's slow, deliberate breathing beneath him, the breathing of a man who had decided to stay calm because calm was the only gift he had left to give. Somewhere in that silence, the thing between them changed, It was not the boy and his hero any. It was not the commander and his lieutenant. It was two men who had put their lives in one another's hands and were now, quite literally, holding on to each other for as long as the engine would keep turning. Neither of them would ever be able to explain it to anyone who had not been in that cockpit. They would spend the rest of their lives trying. Priest flew. The stick moved between his knees through the smallest arc a man could work with, his elbows crushed against his ribs by the walls of the cockpit. Every input had to be gentle and exact. A sudden shove of the stick could jam it against Marshall's trapped legs and roll the airplane into the ground before either of them could draw a breath. The escort pilots, flying close, watched a thin white line begin to trail from the cowling of Priest's fighter. Coolant. The engine was bleeding at last, slowly cooking itself alive, and by the look of it, there were only minutes left before it seized and turned into a great mass of dead iron in the nose. Priest saw the same story written on his gauges. He had two choices, and both of them were bad. He could pull the power back further and stretch out the engine's life and creep home so slowly he might not reach the sea before the light failed. Or he could hold his speed and gamble that the Merlin would hold together long enough to carry them to friendly ground. He chose speed. If the engine was going to die, he wanted it to die over the channel, where the rescue boats patrolled, and not over occupied France, where the Germans would be waiting in the fields to collect what fell out of the sky. The coast came up after what felt like a lifetime of flying. The peninsula slid beneath them, still held by the Allies, after the breakout from Normandy. And Priest let himself breathe. They had crossed out of enemy country at last. If the engine failed now, they would come down among friends. But ahead lay the water, more than 20 miles of cold gray channel between France and England. And Priest had thrown his dinghy into a wheat field, and Marshall had left his to burn with his airplane. If they went down in that water, neither man would last more than a few minutes in the frigid current. Priest looked down once at that water and understood exactly what it was offering them. It was flat and gray, and it went on forever. And it was cold enough to stop a strong man's heart in the time it took to say a prayer. There would be no bailing out over it, because he had no parachute. There would be no floating and waiting for the boats, because he had thrown the raft into the wheat. If the engine quit out here, the two of them would ride the airplane down into the sea, still folded together in that single seat, and the sea would close over them, and no one would ever find the place. He had known all of that on the wing in France when he unbuckled the harness and let it fall. He had chosen it with his eyes open. He kept his hand steady on the stick, and he did not let himself look at the water again. The needle touched the red line as they crossed the halfway point, and Priest watched it quiver there at the very top of its travel, waiting for the silence. That would mean the Merlin had finally given up. The coast of England came out of the summer haze, like a promise. White cliffs, green fields. The engine was still running, coughing now, stuttering, but still turning, still dragging the two of them home. Priest crossed the shoreline and turned toward the home field of his group. A pair of runways laid out in a great cross on the Cambridge farmland. It was still many miles ahead. The engine temperature was still sitting on the red. He had saved his commander from the Germans. Now he had to save them both from the airplane, and the airplane was doing its best to kill them right up until the end. A dozen miles out, the Merlin began to misfire in earnest. The steady roar broke apart into a rough and irregular stutter as overheated cylinders started to let go one by one. Priest richened the fuel mixture and asked the engine for 5 more minutes. Just 5. That was all he needed. Now, below him, the field came into view, and along the main runway he could see the fire trucks and the ambulances already rolling into position. Because the escort pilots had radioed ahead, and the whole base knew by now that something impossible was coming home. He brought the overloaded fighter into the pattern faster than any Mustang was meant to fly it. Because the extra weight meant the wings needed the extra speed just to keep hold of the air. He put the landing gear down and felt the solid, reassuring thump of the wheels locking into place. He let the flaps down by stages. The airplane ballooned, settled, and the runway came up to meet them. He flared. The main wheels kissed the concrete. The tail came down, and the Mustang rolled straight down the center line, slowing. The tortured engine, coughing and sputtering, but still turning over, until Priest stepped on the brakes and brought the whole battered machine to a stop halfway down the runway. The ground crews were already sprinting toward it before the propeller had stopped spinning. They expected to find a wounded man inside, maybe a dying one. Some poor pilot who had nursed a shot-up airplane all the way home on nerve alone. What they found instead was something no one at that base had ever seen, and no one there would ever forget. Two men unfolded themselves out of a single cockpit, slowly, painfully, like performers climbing out of a box built for one. Marshall could not walk. The blood had been shut off from his legs for the better part of 2 hours. And when he tried to stand on the wing, his legs simply would not answer him, and he went down. Crew members caught him and carried him to a waiting ambulance. Priest climbed down under his own power. His flight suit, black with sweat, his legs shaking from exhaustion and from the adrenaline that was only now beginning to drain out of him. The story ran through the whole group within the hour. Pilots crowded around the airplane to see the evidence with their own eyes. Because it was almost too much to believe without seeing. Wheat stalk stuck out of every opening in the airframe. The belly scoop was packed solid with vegetation and dirt. Oil streaked back along the cowling where the overheated engine had finally begun to come apart. The crew chief looked it over and said the Merlin had been within seconds of seizing when Priest shut it down. It took the mechanics 2 days to clean the airplane out, pulling wheat stubble from the wheel wells and the tail and the radiator fins and the gun port, taking the whole cooling system apart to clear the packed debris, replacing coolant lines, inspecting an engine that had been cooked nearly to death. Nothing like it had ever happened in the history of the 8th Air Force. Other pilots had tried to land behind enemy lines to pull out a downed friend. Most of those attempts had ended in disaster. An airplane flipped on soft ground. A second man captured a wreck burning in an enemy field. No one before had put a single seat fighter down behind the German line, loaded a second pilot into a cockpit built for one, and flown home. Priest had done the thing that everyone agreed could not be done. And that created a very awkward problem for the men who ran the air war. Because Lieutenant Royce Priest had disobeyed a direct and lawful order from his commanding officer in combat, not once but twice, he had risked a valuable airplane and his own life on a rescue no one had authorized. By the letter of the regulations, he should have faced a court-martial, but he had also saved the life of one of the most promising squadron commanders in the whole European theater. Anache, a proven leader, a man whose loss would have been felt across the entire group. The question climbed the chain of command until it landed on the desk of the general who ran the 8th Air Force, James Doolittle, the same man who, in the spring of 1942, had launched 16 bombers off the deck of an aircraft carrier toward Tokyo, knowing not one of them could make it back. Every airplane on that raid had been lost. Doolittle had come home expecting a court-martial for losing all of them, and had been given the Medal of Honor instead. Now he sat with the mirror image of his own past. A young pilot who had thrown away the rule book, risked everything on an unauthorized mission, and one Doolittle read the after-action reports, the radio transcripts, the statements from the escort pilots, the maintenance logs. The picture they painted was not in question. Priest had been given a direct order to break off. He had acknowledged it. Then he had gone in anyway. When Marshall had ordered him off a second time from the ground, he had ignored that too. The general understood the danger in celebrating a thing like that. He was losing pilots faster than the training fields back home could replace them. And if every young flyer decided he could throw out the rules whenever his heart told him to, coordinated war became impossible. But Doolittle also understood something the regulations could never hold. He understood that American pilots needed to believe, all the way down in their bones, that their friends would not leave them behind. Priest's flight had proved that the bond between flyers could be stronger than fear, stronger than orders, stronger than the odds. He waited for days. There was no precedent that fit because no one had ever succeeded before. In the end, he made his choice, and it was a careful one. He would not court-martial Royce Priest, neither would he give him the Medal of Honor, though the courage plainly deserved it, because he could not put the nation's highest award on an act of disobedience and send every young pilot in England the message that this was the way to win it. He recommended instead the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration the country could give for valor. It would honor the bravery. Its silence on the Medal of Honor would say the rest. The ceremony took place at the home field on a September day in 1944. Pilots from all three squadrons of the group formed up on the flight line. Ground crews stopped their work to watch. Doolittle himself pinned the cross to the young lieutenant's chest, the same decoration the general had once worn for the Tokyo raid before it was raised to the Medal of Honor. And the meaning of that was lost on no one standing there. He held Priest's hand a moment after the pinning and looked him in the eye and told him the truth. He said he had never once thought to write a rule forbidding a man from landing behind enemy lines to save a friend, because the idea had always seemed too reckless, too impossible for any son man to try. Priest had proved him wrong. What he had done, the general said, was at the very same time the bravest and the most foolish thing he had seen in 2 years of running the air war. The medal was for the bravery. The withheld honor was for the folly. Priest took it without a word of protest. He had expected a court-martial and been given a decoration instead, and that was more than he had ever dared hope for. In the months that followed, other pilots tried the same thing, some of them succeeding, some of them turning one prisoner into two. The tactic was never once written into the rules and never once forbidden. Commanders simply looked the other way. When a man chose to risk everything for a friend, Marshall was back on flying duty within days. His legs recovered. He went on leading, added to his score, earned a Silver Star, rose to command the group before the war was done, and came home with 7 aerial victories to his name. Priest stayed in uniform for decades, flying airplanes the young lieutenant in the wheat field could never have imagined, even serving for a time as a personal pilot to the head of a nation in South America, where he met the woman he would marry. The two of them stayed friends for the rest of their lives, because a bond forged in a cockpit barely wide enough for one man, over enemy ground, with a dying engine and no parachutes, does not fade with the years. And here is the strangest part of all the world very nearly never knew. Priest rarely spoke of it. And when he did, he pushed the credit onto the escort pilots and the ground crews. Late in his life, he set the whole story down at last. In a long letter to Marshall's son, the most complete account he ever gave, and in it he confessed that the waiting afterward, not knowing whether he would be honored or court-martialed, had been harder on him than the flight itself. When he died, an old man in California, his obituary named him a fighter ace and the holder of the nation's second highest award for valor. It listed his long career and his devotion to his family. It did not mention that he had once folded 2 men into a seat built for one and carried them home through the enemy sky. Some stories, it seems, are simply too large for an obituary. The airplane that carried them was never saved. It flew out the rest of the war and vanished into history like 10,000 others. No museum holds a plaque for what happened in it, but the story lived, passed from pilot to pilot, from father to son, written at last into the books Marshall's own son would write about his father's squadron. Two men climbed into a space meant for one and gambled everything, and came home, and as long as anyone tells it, they are not gone.